Hi, I'm Seth Kahn, and I am very pleased to be here with Chris McEntee, who is the former CEO of the American Geophysical Union. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Seth. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you too. I'm so excited to talk to you because actually the Thriving Earth Exchange, which was your baby, came out of the AGU, was the first grand challenge that I had a chance to participate in. Can you take us back to the early days when you were first discussing this before it, when it was being conceived, essentially?
Sure. And I don't like to call it my baby because the kernel of the idea actually came from a very young scientist who was on our science council at the time during a discussion regarding how would AGU do something of great impact in celebration of its 100th anniversary, which is going to be in 2019. So this conversation was probably around 2016, 2017, something like that. And I think his original idea, because he was really into climate science, was that we would do something to address climate change in some big way, probably in a scientific way in terms of funding research grants or something that scientists know more about. But then it became apparent that there's a lot of scientists at AGU. All the scientists at AGU care about the climate change and what's happening to the climate, but not it's so their research does not just focus on climate change. They research everything related to Earth and sun and moons and astro universes and exouniverses and deep Earth and hydrology and water. And so it was hard to think about one grand social issue. So we redefined the problem as we talked to people. And the problem is that a lot of the local communities all around the world, even rich communities, don't necessarily have access to the scientific expertise that existed in the AGU membership. And so what if we could find a way to make that scientific expertise available to any community in the world that was seeking it or thought they needed it? And so that's how we redefined the challenge, was to make broad-based access to scientific expertise.
Wow, that's a powerful concept. And so how did you take that forward? I mean, in those early days when you were just exploring it, what did you do to figure out how to do that?
Well, we spent a lot of time talking to a lot of people who we knew were really thinking about what's now called community science. It wasn't necessarily invented at AGU, but there was this notion of what's community science or participatory place-based science. And so we talked to people who we knew had an interest or had been advocating for a broader use of community science. People like Jane Lipchenko, who was the head of NOAA at one point, people that were deans at environmental studies universities, some people in industry, like the reinsurance industry and others. We just asked people a lot of questions. And our original idea was that we were going to create kind of a network, something you had brought to the AGU board in terms of World Bank, like building upon the networks of networks, and where are there these pockets of innovation occurring. So our original idea was that we were going to have scientist communities and there'd be a funder at the local area. I think, in fact, you connected us to somebody who had done that at another organization you knew about in their profession.
Right.
Everyone we talked to goes, it's a great idea. It's going to be really hard because people have been trying it for a long time. But we weren't put off by that. We just kept talking and talking and talking. And that was our original idea. And then we found out we could find communities and scientists, but we really couldn't find local funders. So we needed to really try to build it with some pilots to see what would work. A key enabler was I was at the conference of the American Meteorological Society and noticed there was this session on participatory place-based science and read the little description. I'm like, oh, that sounds like we want to do. So I went to the session and heard about this gentleman called Raj Pandya, who wasn't in the room at the time, but the organization he worked for, there was a representative there. The head of that organization was there. So I met this head of the organization and we chatted a little bit, and became connected to Raj. And we originally created a contract with this organization for Raj's time to help build the program because this was Raj's passion and interest was really how do you really enable researchers to connect with communities? And so that was a key enabler in this whole thing. So it was a creative staffing model because I didn't have a lot of money. I didn't have to worry about carrying a full-time staff person if it didn't work out, at least for a year. And so we did a contract for Raj's time, which benefited this other organization because they needed some funding to help support some of this time, and it was Raj's passion. So that was a key enabler, really. That and the strong support of the AGU board that was willing to put some investment money into it over several years.
So when I first started working with you on it, it was a small consulting contract. And just as you said, we were going out and you were using my Rolodex to meet people who were doing something that was adjacent to what you wanted to do. And then when that contract concluded, I actually began serving on the AGU board in a public position. And I got to watch how you introduced this concept to the board and socialized it over a lengthy period of time so that people had the chance to think about it, to question it, challenge it, digest it, integrate it. And I also remember, if I'm correct in my memory, that in the initial years, at least, you funded it out of your discretionary budget. Isn't that right?
I don't know. I don't think it was out of our discretionary budget. Maybe the first contract with Raj was. I had a very small discretionary budget in the scheme of the AGU
Right.
overall budget. But we had created at AGU when I arrived what we called our strategic investment funds. And so we used a certain percentage of our reserves every year for either startup new initiatives that eventually we wanted to roll into operations or bringing something into the modern age.
Mhm.
One of the projects was taking our old style 9-point print newspaper every week and turning it into a digital news site. Like money came from those strategic investments. We could budget for them every year, and we had to account for them. And so that was what we proposed using for this program. A second person who was really key, though, in understanding the importance of putting dollars in and not expecting dollars back right away was a man that was at Lockheed Martin who was on our board, Ken.
Oh, yeah. Right.
And he was really an advocate for the organization overall, thinking about some of these investments just like a for-profit or entrepreneurial company would think about it. Like, you can't expect a return in year 1, year 2, year 3. You have to allow these things at least 5 to 10 years and then decide whether they're a success or not. And he was saying that's the way the corporate world um, decides about investments. And so when I think about that, I think, we had the enabler of Raj, but we also had this enabler of this young new scientist that had no history at AGU. He was brand new on the council. It was a new thing for AGU to have students and early career scientists on all their committees and councils. And he had the courage to stand up, and his kernel of the idea ended up being one of our most successful programs. It's still going today.
Wow.
And growing and expanding. And then we had this outside perspective, yours, but we also had somebody from the for-profit world on our board. And so I think that there's lessons in that in terms of opening yourself up broader beyond the people who you normally would think about involving at very high leadership positions in your association.
Well said. Well said. You used a term several times, and I'd like you to just define it for us, which is participatory place-based science. Could you talk a little bit about what that means?
My definition of it is that a community's identifying a problem. If you put it into the AGU sciences, it could be a problem with water quality. It could be a problem with flood control. It could be a problem with air pollution. It could be a problem with soil contamination. And the communities already coalesce to do that. They know they have a problem and they know they want to try to manage that problem, but they're looking for tools and techniques that can help them to do that. And so the scientist has to work with them on how they've defined the problem rather than come in and say, I'm going to solve your problem. So it's really co-creation of a project that marries needed scientific expertise with the goals and objectives of a particular community. So let me give you an example. There was a small community in Maryland that was having issues with when it flooded with agricultural runoff, and they were about to propose to their small community government or city government a proposal for a large amount of money for this for this particular community to build a dam. And the scientists found out that that actually was not going to be the best solution for them. They were asked to evaluate that and came up with an alternate way. I don't remember what the alternate way was, but they saved this community a lot of money through that scientific expertise. There was a community in Colorado that was dealing with public health challenges from industrial waste and building waste from the former Stapleton Airport, but they wanted to grow food. They were in a food desert. They wanted to grow food. So they needed ways to monitor their soil quality in an inexpensive way so they could make sure that the soil was going to be healthy enough. Or if they needed to get assistance from government to remediate the soil, they had their data to show what was needed. And so the scientists work with them in learning how to pick an appropriate sensor, analyze the data, and then the scientists lead. The community can continue to grow. The thing we learn through that is that there's certain things that make a community ready. Generally, it means the community groups have already organized to try to solve whatever this problem is. So they have their own organizing structure, mostly through volunteer effort, that they've coalesced around. But the scientist also has to be a scientist that's willing to listen, to let the community co-create, and not view them. I mean, the scientist has tremendous expertise to give them, but they can't come in and say, this is how I'm going to solve the problem.
Right. Yeah.
They have to co-create what the potential solution is with the community driving a lot of that co-creation. And it's not something that scientists, when they're getting their PhD, get a lot of time to spend it, because there's so much time that has to be spent in learning the research and doing their research and publishing their research and presenting their research and constructing their experiments. They don't really get a lot of opportunity to engage in the more social side of education, such as, how do you educate somebody? How do you partner? How do you communicate well? But there's many that want to do this, particularly as science evolves over time, like feeling that impact, direct impact through some kind of participation.
I remember that Colorado project, and a couple of things that really stood out for me from talking with Raj about it. One was that they used the grant money not just to pay the scientists, but they had citizens working. And I remember Raj saying something about children and grandparents too, that not the people you normally associate with doing research, but people who are legitimate community members. And and that creates, a widespread understanding of what's going on, because they're involved in the actual measurement. It's not like they're reading a report. They're out there, doing the soil samples themselves. They're getting the results. And so it goes in much deeper. They have a deeper cognitive understanding of what's happening, so they can engage better when it comes to solution development. The other thing I remember that Raj said from that particular project is that, a scientist might say, well, here's 15 recommendations, but the community might only want to take action on 12. And they had to accept that. It was like, it was something that in, previous ways of dealing with this kind of intervention, people would be upset about. They said, it's their community. The only place we can get traction is where they're going to do the work. So they get to decide what that is. And I just remember those two elements really making it exciting, actually, for me to think about what was happening in Colorado and in the many other projects of the Thriving Earth Exchange.
Right. But I mean, another key was we piloted it we only found like 3 or 4 places where either the community or the scientist was willing to give us a try.
In the beginning, you're just
That's okay. Like, you don't have to try to do it all at once. Like, it's okay.
right.
Do some things, learn, adjust. So it really was a different way for any organization I've ever worked with like to think about implementing a new program. I mean, it doesn't mean that people don't test something new, but generally in associations, everything has to be kind of thought out before you invest in it, before you try it. And it didn't take us a lot of money in the scheme of things in the beginning. It was a couple $100,000. In fact, I used to frustrate Raj and his team because I'm like, no, I can't get you any more money. This is all I can get. So, I mean, it went up to more. But there was a lot of question at third, fourth year in with the board, like, what are we doing here? Are there any results? When are we going to see results? You're ever going to bring in any grants, Chris? There was a lot of pressure there. And we just kept going, and thankfully the AGU board gave it a little bit longer, and that we started getting some foundation funds, and Raj and his team were very creative in terms of, as more and more scientists wanted to get involved, then it was like, well, how are you gonna do the workshops with the communities that would kind of kick off the project? Because we only had a very small staff team for this. So they created a fellows program. And so these are people who had done projects who then would apply to be a Thriving Earth Exchange fellow. And then they could help start new projects and do some of the facilitation and other things that the staff team had been doing in terms of identifying scientists or helping to the scientists and communities define their problems through an initial workshop. And so it really created like a network effect. So our original goal was by 2019 to have 100 projects, which we did. And at that point, we benefited 17 million people. And then eventually it just kept growing. I don't know. I mean, I haven't been there for 5 years now, so I don't know. All I know, high level, it's still going strong. They've been getting more funding, more people are involved. The staff is bigger. Raj, somebody has succeeded Raj now. He's gotten back into the university setting at Arizona State, I believe. It's either University of Arizona or Arizona State. You may know Seth. But it's continuing, and it received recognition from the American Society of Association Executive. It got one of its top honors for a program that has impact. The third thing I think, though, the association community, if they want to continue grand challenges, is we need a new way of measuring. Because a typical way you measure is dollars and cents, right? You invest this much, and are you at least breaking even? Or are you getting a return on your dollars? But associations are broader than dollars and cents. We're mission-driven organizations. We incorporate under different part of the tax code that's about social benefit. There's different incorporations; they're not all the same. But we're not real good at measuring things that are the social impact. Like, how do you measure that?
Mm-hmm.
How do you measure that and know it's being successful?
Right.
Like, we picked total number of people served.
Right.
There's probably better measurements now in the last 5 years of the past 5 years of the program, because it's been around now for probably 11 or 12 years. But we need to find some additional measures.
So when you talk about finding additional measures, you're talking about, because where my mind goes is across different sectors, right? Like,
Yeah.
we've done grand challenges in finance and nursing, medical ultrasound. These are all very different. Well, maybe nursing and medical ultrasound are related, but I mean, AGU, you're in a really different world than you are when you're bringing in, people of color and women into the finance profession.
Right.
And yet we're talking about social impact. We're not just talking about financial ROI.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Like, how could we measure? I mean, even if you put it into the scientific realm, right? I'm imagining that there's children and teenagers and maybe even young adults looking for a new career in these communities where the Thriving Earth Exchange, or all of a sudden like, hey, maybe I could be a scientist.
Right.
And maybe they decided to pursue a scientific path. But how do we know that?
Right.
It's longitudinal over time, but there's not really a way to capture that. How do we measure the impact of, let's assume the community in Colorado can now grow 50% of their vegetables? I don't know.
Right.
Like, how do you measure that in terms of health or outcome? Or, I mean, you can just imagine so many different things.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the social impact measures aren't that strong. I mean, Wall Street's tried with their ESG, but even those are it's a correlation measure. It's not a real measure of whether things are actually reducing carbon in the atmosphere.
Right. Right. Very important.
I'm not saying those shouldn't be done. I'm just saying that there's a whole field, I think, here to be developed.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Don't ask me how to do it. I'm not
Well, your
contribute to it, but
Yeah, but your experience points to an area that needs to be developed. And speaking of your experience, so when you look back now with 2020 hindsight, is there anything that you could say, well, I really would have done that differently, or that was a really big lesson to learn? You pointed out some already, but I'm just curious about.
yeah, um, I think that maybe, well, we tried, but we probably could have done better at it. Um, it might have been if we could have maybe gotten an earlier advisory group that was even more diverse, like maybe a group of maybe corporations or corporate foundations, other science societies are willing to almost create a consortium with their expertise, their constituents' expertise, but maybe also some funds. Maybe that could have helped a little bit in terms of advising it. You'll probably remember we started the advisory board maybe 2 years into the project, something like that.
Mm,
Not that we didn't have groups meeting. We did.
Right.
It was very difficult at the beginning to explain what we were trying to do and to have people understand it.
That's a common thing with a grand challenge. I mean, you're taking on something that has not been solved before, like the World Bank people telling you it's really hard. It's easy to, people have been trying this for a long time. And yet that seems to be a barrier in itself. It's like if it's not a known thing that people do and you start to explain it, it seems like some very, I mean, to me, you did a great job of explaining it. We've been talking here less than 20 minutes or so, and yet people had real challenges understanding it. And I see that on many different grand challenges.
Yeah. I mean, you have to have I think that you have to have a funding sponsor. Like, to think these things can happen without some funding and some people that are willing to invest without necessarily expecting a return on it. I think it has to be there. I mean, I've seen this even in other things, even smaller efforts. A coalition tries to get together, and it's well-meaning, and they get together, but they don't have funding for an administrative person. So these are busy people coming together because they want to either share or become a community practice. And then somebody in that group has to be the one that's doing the organizing and the agenda planning, and that part of it is just as important as the expertise that's convening in the room, maybe even more important. It's like having some kind of glue that can hold things together.
Yes.
And I think that is sometimes a mistake, particularly, I mean, I know I've done it, because I'm prone to volunteer. Like, I'm on 3 other nonprofit boards right now. And I don't understand sometimes why people feel like they can't make the time to read the materials ahead of time. But that's not the way everybody operates. But it doesn't mean that those individuals also aren't giving their time. Just maybe they prioritize something else rather than reading that material that particular night.
Right.
And so we have to realize that the voluntary spirit doesn't necessarily mean volunteering at the expense of everything else in people's lives.
Right.
And there has to be some kind of glue. It doesn't have to be a bureaucratic glue, but there has to be some kind of glue.
Right.
And I think also I probably underestimated how entrepreneurial it needed to be. Like, we probably changed the model in the first 2 years, or how we operated, or how we went about approaching communities, or even scientists, or the words we used. I don't know, at least 10 times in the first 2 to 3
Wow.
years.
Wow.
So a lot of course changing, a lot of kind of reevaluating strategy, and that's what you mean by entrepreneurial. It's like what do we need to change to make this thing work,
Right.
and a willingness to change a lot if that's what it takes,
Right.
or try
Well,
out, fail a lot.
yeah, and I think the AGU board, they gave us a lot of trust. They were skeptical at times, asked a lot of hard questions at time, but in the end, over a couple years, they still would give us the funding. I mean, rightly skeptical, right? They're stewards of the funds. There's a lot of other needs in an organization as big and global as AGU. So they were appropriate in asking those questions, but they gave 'em a lot of trust and faith in Raj and the team to really
Right.
see what could happen. And now I think there's a community science journal now that's grown out of it. There's lots more partnerships with other similar kind of organizations. And so they put faith in it, and I can't imagine AGU not continuing the program. It seems like it's become part of it's even more reflective in their most recent strategic plan than it was in
Wow.
the strategy when I was there. So I think it's become a good part. And you know what? It expanded the reach of AGU beyond the scientist.
Wow. Yeah. Right.
So
Yeah. Well, thank you.
that'll help in this current period we're in the United States.
Yeah, well, I think participatory place-based community action is a great thing, and learning about grand challenges and how to take on intractable problems is something we definitely need right now. So
Yeah.
thank you for taking your time today. I really appreciate it. This is a very helpful call.
Well, thank you very much. Good luck with all your work on the grand challenges.
Thank you, Chris.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.